Today I'm talking with worldwide syndicated entertainment critic Susan Granger. Miss Granger has an interesting perspective on Hollywood. Having been born into what could be called a Hollywood dynasty, Miss Granger literally grew up on Hollywood sound stages, appearing as a child actress in films with, among others, Abbott Costello, Red Skelton, Lucille Ball, and Lassie. To this day, she can be found on the silver screen. Thank you for inviting us into your home.
Delighted to have you here.
Tell us about your father.
Well, when I grew up in Hollywood, it was in one industry town. My father was powerful, but he was not famous. He made movies like Born Yesterday and All the King's Men, and he died when he was making From Here to Eternity. My mother remarried, and her husband was Armand Deutsch, and he adopted me. So I became he's my adoptive father. That's why I talk about having two fathers. I was very fortunate in that. And he was a producer at MGM, and years ago he told me that MGM had more stars than there were in the heavens. You know what? I believed him.
What was your father doing when you were born?
Well, back then, it was before he was a producer. He was a director, and he was on the MGM lot, and he was directing one of Lana Turner's first films. It was called These Glamour Girls, and I was conveniently born, I'm told. I don't remember these things, but I was told I was born right at the noon hour so that he could rush to the Cedars of Lebanon Hospital, welcome me, and get back and not lose any time on the budget.
Tell us more about your stepfather.
My stepfather, Armand Deutsch, actually he wrote a book called Me and Bogey. He was best known, before he went into the motion picture business, as the intended victim of Leopold and Loeb, that notorious crime of the century in Chicago. And you want me to tell you the story of Leopold and Loeb and how my father escaped?
Absolutely.
Okay. My father was about 10 years old when Leopold and Loeb, who were two very wealthy teenagers in Chicago, decided to commit the crime of the century. They were going to kidnap Armand Deutsch, my stepfather, who was the grandson of Julius Rosenwald, who started Sears Roebuck. Their intention was to get him after school, kidnap him, and kill him, and that would be the crime of the century. The trouble was, the fortunate thing for my father was, he had a dentist appointment. So he was picked up after school and taken to a dentist appointment. So Leopold and Loeb, who had their whole crime planned out, kidnapped a young boy named Bobby Franks, whom they killed instead. And when court testimony came out, they admitted that my father was the intended victim. And of course, after that, my father had to have a bodyguard, and Leopold and Loeb were sent to prison, although Leopold was eventually released.
What was it like growing up in Hollywood, literally on the soundstage?
Well, I loved growing up in Hollywood. My father started me in movies when I was 3 years old. Back then, if you were a director and you needed a 3-year-old girl, there she was, right at home. So the first film I ever made was one with Wallace Beery called Salute to the Marines. And I loved it. I had a great time. I had run of the set, and I could be in a lot of my dad's movies, and then other directors used me in their movies. You have to remember, though, I was never a star. I was always an and also. You know that list of credits? I'm an and also. I was under the name of Susan Stevens and Susan Simon. I couldn't decide which name I wanted. It was good I retired.
Tell us about your Romeo and Juliet scene.
Oh, yes. Well, one time I was going to school, and I was on the MGM lot, and my assignment was to learn the balcony scene from Romeo and Juliet. So I guess I was about 11 years old, 12 years old. And of course, if I was going to do the balcony scene, the first thing I needed was a good balcony. So I went to the balcony warehouse. Now you have to picture, these warehouses were huge, absolutely immense. And they were, in fact, they were sound stages, basically, that functioned as warehouses. And there were naked light bulbs hanging down. So you pulled open the big, heavy door, and there were all of these balconies. lined up, one after another after another. So I looked around, and of course I found the perfect Juliet balcony. And I walked up the stairs, settled myself, opened my script, and started declaiming, I could hardly say I was acting, but declaiming Juliet over the balcony. When all of a sudden, from below me, Romeo answered. And he was a grown-up. I mean, his voice had changed. It was a real actor playing Romeo. So I did Juliet. Romeo answered. I kept trying to look over the top of the balcony to see who Romeo was. But because there was another balcony right there, this was the balcony warehouse, I couldn't see a thing. All I knew was from the darkness below was a wonderful Romeo. We went through the whole scene. When it was over, Romeo said, "Honey, I really think you ought to come down from there. It's dangerous for you to be in here." I thought, oh, he's going to tell my dad. I am going to be in absolutely terrible trouble. So I walked down the stairs, and standing there was the handsomest man I have ever seen in my entire life. His name was Errol Flynn. He kissed me right here, and he said, "Come back again in a few years and we'll do this."
That is great.
That was my encounter with the notorious Errol Flynn.
Tell us about the reality of being a child star.
Well, the reality is nothing like what you see in the movies or you hear about. Growing up in Hollywood was not as easy as you would think. It was very difficult not to confuse reality with make-believe. For me, acting was playing. I had a great time playing with my father on the set. But it wasn't like that for Mickey Rooney, who came from a vaudeville family. Donald O'Connor's mother was a circus bareback rider. And most movie kids were simply pushed forth by very ambitious parents. Darryl Hickman once asked his mother why she put him in the movies at the age of 3. And you know what his mother said? "Honey, it's what you always wanted." The truth is, most Hollywood children were pushed by very ambitious parents. Dick Moore, who was a wonderful child star, wrote a book called Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, But Don't Have Sex or Take the Car. And what he pointed out after he'd interviewed a lot of child actors was that all these children had 3 things in common. 1, an early intelligence. 2, a very sharp memory. And 3, a desperate need for approval. But above all, they really felt if they couldn't earn money, they had no value. Now, do you know what this does to children?
Tell us about King Charles.
King Charles was my horse. Well, technically, he was my father's horse. When I was very little, my father, this was Sylvan Simon, had horses that he kept at a place called Leo Dupe Ranch in Culver City, California. And I learned to ride on a huge chestnut jumper that he had named King Charles. I guess I was about 3 or 4 years old, and at that age, I always thought King Charles was my horse. And I loved this horse. And then all of a sudden, King Charles disappeared. And when I asked what happened to him, they said Louis B. Mayer bought him. He was going to be in a movie called National Velvet. And in fact, he became the pie in National Velvet. And eventually, Louis B. Mayer gave him to Elizabeth Taylor. Now, back then, I would cry and I'd say, "Elizabeth Taylor stole my horse." Of course, as I grew up, I realized I was very lucky that was all she took.
You also have a brother in the business. Tell us about him.
I adore my brother. His name is Stephen Simon, and he is a producer and director. Actually, he's based out of Portland, Oregon at the moment. He made movies called Somewhere in Time and All the Right Moves and Conversations with God. He started something called the Spiritual Cinema Circle online and is very into making spiritual cinema.
I understand you have a son in the business as well.
I certainly do. As I said, this is a family business from father to me to brother to son. My son's name is Don Granger. He's a producer. He made movies like Mission Impossible, Star Trek, and Saving Private Ryan.
Is the film business an art or a business?
Well, nobody's ever called it show art, have they? They call it show business. And believe me, it is a business. And that's what you have to keep in mind, whether you're going to the movies and seeing a movie or whether you're on my side as a critic.